The topic of research in digital patient engagement is fairly new, just like digital patient engagement itself is a fairly new category. And traditionally in this industry, we rely so heavily on research for proving the efficacy of a new, maybe it's a new therapy or a new drug or a new device. And so today we wanted to explore, what's research like in digital patient engagement. Do you want to kick us off in terms of what your thoughts are on using digital patient engagement for research, but then also research on digital patient engagement?
Yeah, Alan, maybe I'll start by saying that I came for myself from the clinical and the research world, and then now that I'm on the technology and more of the vendor side, I've really come to appreciate the challenge that comes with marrying both of those. When you start off in the research in the clinical world, you realize the importance of doing proper research on new interventions, particularly around interventions to improve patient care, because you want to make sure that if you give something to a patient, it actually works, particularly because patient safety is paramount before even thinking about the outcome of something. So you have to make sure it's safe and you need to make sure it's effective. And there's no better example than what's going on right now in the world with COVID-19. There is a lot of misinformation in the world right now about, what treatments or therapies are effective for COVID-19. And we rely heavily on our, clinical partners and clinicians and researchers to help the public, navigate like what we really should be treating patients with during COVID-19. And so I can definitely appreciate the importance of proper research when you're talking about patient care. And I think healthcare is unique, Alan, in that there's a much higher bar to introducing something into the work environment. In any other industry, for the most part, if you introduce something that doesn't work or that is bad, I mean, there aren't really that many bad things that can happen. For example, I'll give you an example. So let's talk about ed tech, right? Mm-hmm. Universities, colleges, schools. If you introduce an ed tech solution that messes up, I mean, what's the worst that could happen?
Mm-hmm. You miss a class.
Up some grade. I don't know. Like,
yeah.
What's the worst that could happen? Like nothing bad.
Exactly.
No one's going to lose a label for it. But if you introduce something, some tech into healthcare and it messes up, I mean, you could seriously hurt someone's life. And so the bar to proving something works and is safe in healthcare is much higher, which is fair. I think the challenge that I noticed going into the health tech side of things, and now as a vendor, is that, we're so used to researching interventions such as medical devices and drugs. And I think a lot of times we try to fit software and applications into that same approach without realizing that it doesn't actually fit very well sometimes. I'll give you a quick example on that, and then feel free to kind of point me where you want to point me on this. But when I think of drugs and medical devices, these are interventions that are pretty fixed, right? Like once you actually have designed a drug or you've developed a medical device and then you're testing it in trials, it's a pretty set intervention, and either it works or it doesn't work. But what's unique about software applications, so that includes mobile apps, web applications, etc. Once you enter the software world, you realize that it's very much an iterative process. It is very normal in the software world that version 1 or version 2 or version 3 doesn't necessarily work that well in terms of efficacy, but it's that iterative process and the fact that software can actually quickly improve as you write new code and you change workflows and things. Version 10, 20, 30 not only might start suddenly being actually effective, but it actually keeps getting better over time. And it's hard to and I think unless you've been on the software side as a researcher or healthcare provider, you actually don't really understand the fact that software is supposed to be iterative, and you don't really appreciate that the way you approach evaluating software in healthcare from a research point of view needs to consider that iterative opportunity as you design studies, as you measure effectiveness and so forth. Let me know if that doesn't make sense. I'm happy to kind of dive deeper on that.
No, that totally makes sense. Just to provide an example of the iterative process, maybe an app is starting out and their V1 is, you can download this app through the iTunes Apple Store. and go ahead and get your app, and hopefully the patient can use it. And what you'll find really quickly, I mean, just looking at my parents, for instance, they forget their iTunes passwords all the time. So a patient is not going to download the app necessarily. And so, V2 of the product is going to be, well, we have to make it available on the web without an iTunes, without the app, maybe a text message or an email. So that's the idea of this iterative process. And you don't get that feedback unless you're measuring it on actual, users. And in this case, with the health tech side, the user is the patient. And so I think what you're saying, Josh, is the traditional format of research that is being done on drugs and on devices is now being applied to, let's say, this digital patient engagement or some sort of software. And it's basically the same sort of design structure for the software. And maybe that structure is not the best at bringing value into the healthcare industry, because we need to iterate, and you need that patient data and be able to iterate from there. I think also research in that space and how that's designed, it requires the software to almost be frozen in place. So let's say we're on V5 of the product. Let's do a study on V5 of the product. So no iteration can be done, while this research is being conducted, because you don't want to intervene, and that's the main drawback from doing research in that capacity. But I mean, obviously, research does play a part in determining the efficacy of a program and whether it's safe for patients. There needs to be due process there, and so research is important from that space. But what are your thoughts on either technology being frozen in place for a study, or else if there's other pitfalls that you're thinking of for the way that we're researching and designing our studies for digital patient engagement today?
Yeah, so when I think about the ideal way to do research on digital patient engagement in terms of effectiveness, I do think it's important in order to demonstrate that it actually does work in a controlled setting. I think the early stages of doing digital patient engagement, especially if you're, let's say, starting it for the first time as a company, as an organization, the early stages should probably be done more as a quality improvement initiative with rapid iteration cycles and less as a formal research study. So what I would do is say, you know what, like, let's create a quality improvement process, or in QI in healthcare, we use like the PDSA Plan, Do, Study, Act, where there's rapid iteration on the implementation process, maybe the features in the product, the workflows, the algorithms, et cetera, rapidly iterate that from version 1 or version 10, version 20, wherever that is. And then once you're pretty satisfied with how it's working and you're seeing benefit, at least in anecdotally or at least in early data, and you feel like it really, and maybe you've even done a small, comparison, maybe, and then so basically you now comfortable freezing the intervention, it's valuable to study it formally. Maybe then you start the formal evaluation process on what that final solution and workflow and implementation style is at the organization. So that way, you've both proven the feasibility of it, but then you could actually do a formal study that is honestly, more worth doing. And I think that's better than where you just kind of implement version 1 and then wait for like 1,000 patients to go through it. And you really shouldn't expect it to work, because version 1 is never going to work in the first place. And I think that's important, because if you don't do it properly and you're kind of studying a very unpolished version of it, then honestly also stymies, I think, progress in the industry and among research, right? I mean, I'll give you a good example. If you look at the research on things like remote patient monitoring and telehealth and telemedicine, and you look at even robust studies such as RCTs done in the space, you'll find that there are some RCTs on remote monitoring telemedicine that says it works. And then you find half of the studies that says that it doesn't work. And probably the issue was that in the cases where it doesn't work, there's probably execution issues where it just wasn't, where there's gaps in execution, how they did it. And you probably, if you take those same organizations and you gave them time to actually learn best practices from other groups who've done it well, iterate the process, figure out how to make it work in their workflows, and then do the RCT, I think it's more likely they would have had successful results as well. But then what happens instead is, because you had different organizations with different levels of execution performance, you now have this mashup of different results in the literature, and it's unclear to an outsider, okay, well, does it work or doesn't work? And the truth is that, well, the devil's in the details, obviously, right? And in fact, I mean, give an example, like, even though you could take some of our clinical partners, and even though on the surface it sounds like they implement the same solution, Alan and I, you both know that we have some clinical partners who have, let's call it, more sophisticated workflows and implementation processes and staff engagement, who get far better results with the platform than others who are maybe less engaged or not as consistent in how they use the solution and things like that. And the results, aren't as outstanding as the first group. But if they both wrote the paper, it would sound the same in terms of how the paper sounded, but just the results would be different. And so I think what I've realized is that, software is not a magic pill. The technology does matter, but the execution matters as well. And I think getting that done right first then lends itself well to kind of proper research and useful research, to be honest.
Absolutely. I will do a shameless plug for another one of our episodes. Episode 9 was focused on the best practices for implementing digital patient engagement. And so that definitely goes into some more of those details in terms of, what makes a successful implementation versus an unsuccessful implementation. Josh, would you say it's fair to say that some of the studies that have been done that show, maybe this technology is not actually effective, would you say maybe they're underestimating the potential of that iterative process and the ability for the technology to change over time and create something new?
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that like the research studies really focus on almost simplifying the intervention, because if you think about it, no two software interventions are identical.
Right.
So for example, let's take even just SeamlessMD, right? If you took SeamlessMD from, version 1 7 years ago, and you compare the effectiveness of both technology and the implementation frameworks we have to SeamlessMD of 2020, even though the name of the intervention is the same.
Yeah.
Right. Someone could look at a study from 7 years ago that we published, and one from today that we published, and it sounds like on paper the same intervention. Even the vendor name is the same that's being acknowledged, and the results are going to be wildly different.
Right.
They're still going to call it a digital patient engagement platform in both studies, but one study is going to say digital patient engagement does not make an impact on outcomes, and the other study is going to say it makes an amazing impact on outcomes.
Right.
Even with the same vendor name on it. And I think that's kind of the pitfall of, let's call it doing really, really, really early research without having actually proven something out. But I think that's also the exciting thing about software, in that there's opportunities for the outcomes to actually get better over time. I think the other challenge that we notice is that there's definitely a major lag time between when research studies are actually conducted and then the actual publication of it. And so one of the challenges is that by the time research does come out, it's not uncommon that it's 2 or 3 years old.
Right. And in that time, the amount of versions that can change in the product is huge. It could go from, V5 to V20.
Absolutely. And to be honest, like, I don't know, I'm definitely not an expert on some of the challenges in the publication world and how to get data out there faster. That's not a challenge that's unique to digital patient engagement. It's true for the entire research industry. But I think that for software it's a bit more challenging in the sense that by the time, like you said, like the years have passed, the actual intervention, it could be far different or far better. But we're being measured based on data that's 2 to 3 years old. So that's something that we just have to deal with, I guess.
Right. And actually, just because I'm sure there's folks listening who haven't seen some of the other episodes, but an example, a more concrete example using SeamlessMD in terms of how the product has changed was, and Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first version of the product basically had a survey that would track patient symptoms post-op or post-discharge. They'd go home and fill out a simple, symptom tracker basically.
And it was only
And
on smartphones and tablets, and only as a mobile app. It wasn't on the web. It wasn't on the computer. Um,
And let
and
and
yeah,
for instance, let's say it was because I think that was in colorectal where we first did it. And let's say it
yeah,
was a patient with a stoma or like an ostomy, and patient would input that they have a stoma, and then the app would continue on asking more questions. Whereas today, if a patient mentions, yeah, I have a stoma, they're going to get a completely different set of questions asked, and they're going to get a completely different set of education that's delivered to them based on that input that they have. That wasn't in V1, is that right?
no. But and even more than that, our workflows, our algorithms are way more sophisticated than they were from that V1 many years ago. Even things as simple sounding as our playbooks and scripts for educating, providers about how to describe Seamless to a patient or how to engage them to adopt it and be compliant with it. All those execution aspects, which impact patient engagement outcomes, are far better now than they were, 7 years ago. But you're not going to read about that part of it in the research study
Right,
methodology, even though
right.
those details actually do matter.
Absolutely, yeah.
When I think about it, a good analogy is even something like evidence-based protocols such as enhanced recovery after surgery, where you can have several different studies in the same population, let's say colorectal surgery, and you have some studies where maybe the outcomes are better and
Mhm.
others where the outcomes are not as good. They all say they're doing enhanced recovery,
Right.
but then maybe when you dig into the actual details, one organization executed better and had far higher provider and patient compliance with the
Right.
steps, and unsurprisingly had better outcomes. But oftentimes, like those, compliance execution data points are not in the study,
Mhm.
and so no one realizes why it's different, and all they can assume is that, well, you both enhanced recovery, you did the same thing, but did
Mhm.
they do the same thing? I don't
Right.
know. They did some of the same things,
Mhm.
right?
And then it's tricky because somebody might, put together a meta-analysis just looking at all these different research papers on enhanced recovery, and they might see, well, 75% of the time it's effective. But, compared to like a digital patient engagement, it might be, well, it can be effective, it can also not be effective. You draw your own conclusion, kind of like. But I think that's the point: is the devil is in the details, and it's how is it implemented? What was the usage like with the product? Is it actually being used? Is it actually being vocalized to patients properly? There's a whole bunch of other details that aren't maybe captured in research as we have it set up today. I think another point that I've seen as a pitfall in researching digital patient engagement is the sample size that we're choosing for studies. Oftentimes we have this one, subset of patients that we believe in our heads, they will definitely benefit from using this technology. And so we'll dig into that. And maybe it's okay, I have 20 patients that would be perfect for this pilot. But in actuality, it's like, well, I have 500 cases that I do per year, but let's start with, a study that's just looking at the 20 to prove it out as a proof of concept. And I think with that logic, because it is this iterative process, and treating it more as a quality improvement initiative in the first place might be better and more beneficial to a larger number of people, as if we can use this intervention on, let's say, the whole 500 patient population, and from that data be able to iterate the process and iterate the product to become even more effective to scale out, let's say, for next year or even larger, the entire patient population. Do you have any thoughts on that and the sample size that you've seen for researching this?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think our most successful partners have, I'll call it, viewed it as either a quality improvement or just a standard of care improvement with SeamlessMD first and foremost, and then they view research as kind of a bonus in terms of being able to use all this wonderful data to either look at the patient-reported outcomes or measure the efficacy of the solution. But when they viewed it as a quality improvement standard of care initiative first, they get huge sample sizes, hundreds or thousands, and then frankly their analysis is more meaningful in terms of the assessment. And I think the ones who may have struggled in the past are the ones who viewed it from a research first focus, where, like you said, maybe they're trying to only put in 20 or 30 patients, because typically in their past studies, they're only doing 20, 30, 40, 50 patients. But let's be honest, that's not a very meaningful sample size. And especially when you're, introducing a brand new workflow, it could take 10 or 20 patients for your staff to get used to this change. But for a lot of our partners, 10, 20 patients is maybe 2 weeks worth of patients. It's like, well, you give it 2 weeks. Let us help you, make it successful in the workflow. And then let's measure the next, 6, 12 months of results and hundreds or thousands of patients. And actually, frankly, for your research, it's a lot more compelling if you have, 500 or 1,000 patients in your sample size. That's far more likely to get publication or presentation than 10 or 20. And so I think people have to realize that for the most part, digital patient engagement is a far safer, intervention than a lot of other things that are being used in healthcare. And we have to recognize that, given that it's relatively safe, you can put more patients on it and not be as worried. Frankly, these patients have phones already, or devices or computers. Like, you're just taking advantage of what they're normally doing on digital, and just staying more connected with them. So I think groups can be a lot more aggressive with their sample sizes, and the partners who have been very successful on the research side as well because of that.
I think also, the fact that the digital patient engagement is from the clinical team, and it's including their own protocols, their own education, it's customized. So it's not like, because you hear it all the time where, patients on WebMD or they're on a Facebook group and they're getting misinformation everywhere, and they're taking that to heart, and that's what they're listening to, as well as the physician's word. But they're getting a bunch of different education, in quotes, from different sources. And so with you saying, the digital technology is safe for patients, presumably it's been reviewed by the team. It's got their own education on there, their own protocols, their own patient care that they would normally give to patients, and now it's just being delivered right to the patient, and it's in a place where the patient is going to be using it. And then, like you're saying, if the execution is done properly, you'll hit those usage rates. You'll have patients actually engaging with the product, and that's where you can get that big outcome and see the outcome improvements.
I think that's the other neat thing, Alan. It's like, there's often this almost competing interest between research and outcome in terms of clinical outcomes or clinical benefit, right? So if you look at things from a purely research lens, you don't actually care if the intervention works or not. You just want to do the research properly. Whereas if you are focused on outcomes, or focused on this being a quality improvement initiative, you are generally trying to improve either the solution or the workflow or the execution to try and achieve a result. And I think that makes it challenging sometimes, when I think as a company, we view research as a mechanism to validate what we do. Frankly, sometimes it helps with marketing, because then maybe it gets the word out about Seamless. But ultimately, we care about, okay, this has to work though. Like, we don't get benefit if there's a research study that doesn't actually lead to an outcome, or that it's a good outcome, but then it doesn't get sustained because it's viewed as a research study. We ultimately care about, how does this become the standard of care and actually help patients and help providers. And so I think, I would encourage, researchers to really think about, okay, like, is there value for this for our patient in the organization? And then it's great if we can get research out of it too. And I think the other thing too, Alan, is that, like, we're at a point now where we just have so much data on the fact that how we're approaching this works, that I almost think that if we're going to do research, it's almost as if at this point feasibility is less important. And what's more important is, like, let's do some really cool research with the actual data. So for example, like, I'm really excited about the fact that we have partners who are doing research on using the opioid patient-reported outcomes to understand opioid consumption, where there's still very little understanding of actual patient opioid use, for example. Or our partners who are looking at things like measuring health literacy scores as it correlates to patient engagement, or looking at, maybe what's the frequency of certain symptoms occurring after surgery, and capturing that through the platform. So I think at some point it'd be nice to see the research shift more and more from can a patient even use this? We have so much data saying yes, they can.
Mhm.
Let's move towards answering the research questions that are actually unknown. I think that's far more compelling at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Josh, tying it back to what we were saying about like enhanced recovery, maybe, compliance wasn't so strong with patients and providers. I think a big part of it is, are we able to actually measure compliance? And so it's kind of a bit of a paradox there, because it's like, to have, better research, we need some of that data. And to get that data, we almost need an intervention like a SeamlessMD, where we can actually start collecting patient compliance and we can capture some of those patient reported outcomes. And I think we'll have to probably do a whole other podcast topic on patient reported outcomes and PROs. But um, the fact that we're collecting any patient reported outcome from a patient in any time increment that you want, there's a ton of research that can be done just from that pool of data that's coming in. So exactly what you're saying, we need to start doing research on this data and actually have a meaningful approach for this. I don't know if you have any thoughts to add on to that. But.
No, I think the sky's the limit. I think that is the neat thing about it. And I think, up until this point, there has been a lot of research on, patient reported outcomes in general, but certainly what digital patient engagement is going to enable is doing lots more data collection at scale, particularly during COVID-19. Doing lots of remote patient reported outcomes data collection is key. No one's going to want to come into the clinic just to fill out surveys. But then the other unique thing is that, with digital engagement, you're collecting a lot more granular data points about the patient. So typically patient reported outcomes, you're collecting, one data point, let's say a month before, hospital admission, 3 months after discharge, 6 months, 12 months. But as you know, on Seamless, a lot of our partners are collecting daily data from patients. And so there's a much richer data set that researchers typically didn't have access to. And that's very exciting. And so, let's shift towards doing, research on thousands of data points from patients and not just, 3 or whatever it is. I think that's definitely going to be a major thing going forward.
Definitely. And then taking all of that together and applying some machine learning to it and really predicting outcomes. And there's a whole bunch of I'm excited for the future is what I'm trying to get at. There's a ton of data that's being collected, and we have this potential now to really use that data in meaningful ways.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing is that that future is now. And here's the thing: my pitch to researchers is, everyone's done feasibility. Like if you go like patient apps feasibility, digital engagement feasibility, remote monitoring feasibility, it's been done before. This is a chance to actually kind of leapfrog what's being done in the literature, because most people aren't actually leaping ahead to actually, ask the more compelling novel questions that we're talking about here, Alan. And again, if people want to go on the feasibility route, that's fine too. But I think they'd be missing out on kind of the bigger opportunity that they could build some real thought leadership in.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I could probably talk for another hour on this topic, but I think you and I both wanted to try and cut down some of the time on these podcasts.
Alan, are you saying that we've gotten feedback that we've talked too much on the podcast sometimes?
Exactly. We had our own research study that went out, and we got some feedback from our listeners, and they were saying, as much as we love you guys, if we could shorten the podcast down maybe by 20%, that would probably be great. So I think with that,
20%.
Yeah, just 20%. Yeah, so we can ramble on for a couple more minutes, and everybody's going to be happy. But I think with that, the conversation has definitely inspired another topic. I think I would like to dive into patient-reported outcomes. And folks who are listening, if that's a topic that's near and dear to your heart, and you'd like to understand how digital patient engagement exactly works with patient-reported outcomes, and how you can leverage some of that data for the future. But as Josh was saying, the future is now with the technology. So let us know. But I think that's definitely a topic that I'd be interested to learn more about. And I know it is a pretty exciting topic that especially folks in the research space are interested in. So I think we'll end it here for now, Josh. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add on the research topic today.
Alan, I have a ton that I could talk about, but we got to keep it interesting. So if people want to hear our next thoughts on it, I guess I'll have to come back to the podcast.
There you go. Yeah, that's a great idea, Josh. All right, well, we'll end it here then. And everybody listening at home, just let us know what you thought about this new format, keeping it shorter today. And we'll hopefully get another episode in about patient-reported outcomes on the way.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alan.
Thanks, Josh. See ya.
See ya.